Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned. We were supposed to return yesterday, Roger, but we didn't. But we're here today. It's been that kind of week. But we're here today with a deep philosophical question because, Roger and I are pretty deep thinkers. And our question is, why do some books endure? I don't really have an answer, but perhaps some of you do. Why do some books endure and survive the test of time? Why do some books become classics? Classics, Roger, the haunt of the public domain. It's not just because they're in the public domain, though. There are plenty of books in the public domain that you could find on Project Gutenberg that are completely forgotten. In fact, most of the books on Project Gutenberg have been completely forgotten over time. And it's not always because of literary quality either that some books last. There are plenty of great books that have been forgotten. There are some books that are considered classics that are not so great, but they are classics for a reason. Sometimes it's because of their historical importance. Sometimes it's because they were the first work of literature that does a certain thing. Usually, though, literature lasts because it's good. Usually classics are classics because they're good. And what got me thinking about this subject is this book that I was paging through. This is my old Penguin Classics book, which is really nice. I made a whole video about this, Roger, about 100 years ago. Wasn't quite that long, but almost. The Penguin Classics book, which is really cool. You go through this, you can see a bunch of different Penguin Classics that have been published over the years. Get some ideas for some different books you might want to read. But in the back of this book, there's a certain section, let me see if I can get to it, called the vaults. See if I can get to the vaults. Here it is, the vaults. So in this section, we have a bunch of Penguin Classics that are no longer in print. These are out of print Penguin Classics. There's a few pages of these. And so these are classics that are no longer classics for whatever reason. Penguin Classics stopped publishing them, and now you can't get them unless you find them in the used bookstore somewhere. But once they were classics, according to Penguin, however, of course, unfortunately, I no longer trust Penguin, and haven't for quite some time, to tell me what a classic is. Notoriously, of course, Penguin Classics published Morrissey's autobiography as a Penguin Classic because Morrissey insisted. He wouldn't let Penguin publish his autobiography unless they published it as a Penguin Classic. So they did. And in doing so, they did more than just sell out. They betrayed their readers, and they betrayed their own mission. So that kind of sucked. It's funny, but it kind of sucked. I'm not actually sure whether any reprint house can really be trustworthy in this regard. But Penguin, yeah, definitely not. Although I really like them and they do publish a lot of good books. And it's an interesting question. Why do some books endure over time? And I thought one thing I would do to kind of illustrate this and help me ponder the question is I dragged out a box of books. I've got a box of books here. All these books I rescued from recycling. They were going to be recycled, and so I rescued them and put them in a box, took them home and left them in a box. And they've been in a box for a long time. But now I'm taking them out of the box to talk to you about them because they're pretty cool. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this line of books. This is, let me get it right. This is a series of books that was published by Black's Readers Service Company. Black's Readers Service Company. And what that was, it was a publisher who was they're kind of like the Book of the Month Club back in the day. It was a subscription service, and every month they would send you a book that was the works. It was the works of a classic author or a popular author. And these were published, I believe, from the 1930s, the early 30s at least, I think, until the 1950s. I don't know if they survived the 1950s. I am not certain. But they were around at least at that time. And so when you got these books, you got what was considered, by Plax Readers Service Company at least, what was a classic or at least a popular author at the time. And they're nice books. They're double columned, so they can pack a lot in here. Like this is the Robert Louis Stevenson volume, and it has a lot in here. What is in here? I'll look at the contents page. So it's got poems. It's got Treasure Island, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Kidnapped, Master of Ballantrae, and the entire New Arabian Nights, which is a short story collection. So starts off with poetry, and then you get a ton of fiction. So you get a lot in this volume. Robert Louis Stevenson, of course, is still considered a classic author. All of those books I just mentioned, with the exception of the poetry and New Arabian Nights, are regularly published. And even the New Arabian Nights you can get in a volume of his complete short stories. All that stuff is pretty readily available. Robert Louis Stevenson, still a classic author as he was then. This next author, it's a little different. This is H. Rider Haggard, who was, at the time, considered a popular author. And perhaps if he was not a classic author, he was destined to be a classic author at least. He was considered that. However, nowadays, we don't remember Haggard for much. We remember H. Rider Haggard for a couple of books. A couple of his books have survived to be still read by readers. That would be King Solomon's Mines and She. Both of those books are not read by a lot of people, but they are still remembered, while most of his books, for the most part, are forgotten. There are some folks here on BookTube who still remember H. Rider Haggard, but certainly for the general public, and I think the general reading public, no, he's most of his works have been forgotten. Volume 1 in here is Cleopatra. He did a novel about Cleopatra, which nobody remembers. And then we've got She, King Solomon's Mines. Allan Quatermain is in here, which is the sequel to King Solomon's Mines, which is really good. H. Rider Haggard had a long Allan Quatermain series because it became a series because it was very popular. That character was very popular. Most of those books are not frequently read. And if you want to read them, you pretty much have to get them as ebooks. You can get some cheap public print-on-demand copies of those probably, but that's probably the only way you'll get them. So yeah, H. Rider Haggard. Then we've got Bret Harte. Bret Harte, who is another author who was destined to be a classic author, probably was considered a classic author at the time, but is now mostly forgotten, I think. I seldom hear Bret Harte mentioned, but he was a short story writer for the most part. And this volume has a bunch of his short stories and also poems. It has poems by him as well. So it's an interesting volume. And this one is not double columned because it didn't need to pack a bunch of, it didn't take up as much space in this one, probably. So it's got a different format. But it's a nice book. And so if you're interested in this author, this is, still available for cheap, probably, if you tried to find it on eBay or something. I've seen these books, these Black's Service Readers Company's books, pretty cheap. You'll find them at used bookstores frequently, usually in terrible shape. Although they're pretty sturdy little volumes. These things, the ones I have, are probably from the 1930s or 40s, and they've held up really well over the years. What else do we have in here? Of course, we have the works of Hugo, Victor Hugo. He is still remembered He is a genuine classic author who is still read frequently with Les Mis. And the book that's in here, the works of Victor Hugo, of course, these are just selected works. This has poems, but the main thing that takes up the space in this book is The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And so we have all of that, which is something you can get easily. But we also have in here stories of crime. Victor Hugo did stories of crime, which is in the back of this volume, as well as essays on humanity. And there's quite a few essays on humanity in here, which sounds kind of interesting, the essays on humanity. So this is an interesting volume. So that's Victor Hugo. We've also got Arthur Conan Doyle. Arthur Conan Doyle is still considered a classic author, but we really only know Arthur Conan Doyle for one thing nowadays, and that's Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is immortal. He's an immortal character. All of the Sherlock Holmes books written by Arthur Conan Doyle will probably be published until there are no people reading at all, which isn't quite here yet, but it feels like it's coming. And so in the works of Arthur Conan Doyle, as you would expect, you find Sherlock Holmes, but not a lot of Sherlock Holmes. You would think this whole thing would be Sherlock Holmes, but it's not. You've got a few short stories, you've got The Sign of the Four, but then you would get The White Company, which is an historical novel that isn't entirely forgotten nowadays, but almost nobody reads it. I don't know if there's like a Penguin edition of The White Company. There probably is an Oxford edition, maybe, but it's not something many people, I think, read anymore. And then it's got some short stories in it. So yeah, Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a ton. He wrote a ton of books, and most of them have been out of print for decades. Usually you can find in a bookstore Sherlock Holmes, and maybe if you're lucky, The Lost World. But anything else? Probably not. What else do we have in here? We've got Anton Chekhov. Chekhov is still considered a classic writer. So this is just a ton of his short stories. He's still considered a classic. This is interesting. This is Gilbert and Sullivan. Gilbert and Sullivan. Popular, I suppose, at the time, but not the kind of thing you would expect, I think, to just have in a book in a line of classic or popular books. At least you wouldn't nowadays. But Gilbert and Sullivan, you have a bunch of Gilbert and Sullivan's works in here. What do we have in here? The Sorcerer, Trial by Jury, The Mikado or the Town of Titipu, The Pirates of Penzance, or The Slave of Duty, as it is also known. So, drama. Gilbert and Sullivan. At the time, I guess this was not particularly unusual. And we've also got Henrik Ibsen. Henrik Ibsen. Not a name you hear much anymore. At the time, was Ibsen's work something that you would think would just be considered a classic of literature? It's all, it's all plays, but not a name you hear too much anymore, but this is a nice volume. They also did, Alfred Tennyson. Tennyson, okay. Got some Tennyson in here. Some poetry. Poetry, Roger. Which pretty much is not read by anybody anymore. There are a few people. You get a few people on BookTube. But BookTube, remember, is a pretty unusual community when you think about it. If you watch BookTube, you might think, wow, there are a hell of a lot of readers out there. Not really. Not when you consider how many people are out there. The general population, we're just a teensy tiny fraction who read this stuff, And even I don't read Tennyson. We're just not sophisticated enough, Roger. But if I wanted to, I've got a really nice copy. I won't go through all these books, but you kind of get the point. There are some authors in here, you know, Jonathan Swift. This is basically just Gulliver's Travels, still considered a classic. Robert Browning, more poetry, so, you know, of course, forgotten. We also have, they also did some really nice anthologies. They did adventure stories, and This Is the World's Great Detective Stories. A lot of detective stories that have probably been forgotten by authors who have probably been forgotten. Although there's some big names in here. We've got Edgar Allan Poe, got Mark Twain, Stevenson's in here. But we've also got, you know, actually there are a lot of good names in here. Leo Tolstoy, Raphael Sabatini, not people that you generally consider to be detective writers. Thomas Hardy, and a bunch of authors and stories you don't hear much about. So this is kind of a cool book. And they did adventure stories, they did romance stories, and they did great detective stories. So this is cool stuff. And it's kind of interesting, the work of Charles and Mary Lamb. Charles and Mary Lamb. It's interesting. These were, like I said, either popular books or what they considered at the time classics. And some things just did not stand the test of time as classics. And others we kind of remember. But it makes me think of all of those authors who just wrote tons of books, and we know them for one or two. Jules Verne is one of those authors. We know Jules Verne for a few books, but he wrote like 80 or something. Same thing for H.G. Wells. We know him for like 7 or 8 books. He wrote a ton. All of that stuff, it's all available as ebooks. You can go to Project Gutenberg and get all of this stuff. And it's worth a journey to Project Gutenberg just to see what's out there. It's instructive, I think, to see just how many books are available in the public domain. Many of them popular and famous, but many of them just forgotten. And how many classics of literature that we consider classics today will last into the future? 100 years from now, if we're still around, which is a question, 100 years from now, if there are any readers still reading books, another question, what will be read from our past? Are there any books being written today that will last and still be read 100 years from now? Probably not. I think it's actually, frankly, unlikely. But you never know. You never know what will end up being a classic, I think. Some books are forgotten for a long time, and then they are suddenly remembered for one reason or another. It's interesting. It's an interesting question. I'll shut up. I've talked long enough. I will catch you next time.